multinational coverage Central Europe for Bnp Paribas. Bjorn, very welcome to you and to your team. I will pass the floor to Bjorn in a minute. He will introduce his team and then we will immediately kick it off. Just maybe from a very practical perspective, we will go into a session with three presentations of the team of Bjorn. Bjorn will introduce them himself. So I suggest that during the presentations, all of us stay muted. Point one. Point two, questions that you might have, feel free to put them during the presentations into the chat. We will pick them up after the presentations. And of course, if that would not be the case, obviously feel free after the presentation to unmute yourself and ask the question directly to one of the speakers. But in order to make sure we stay within the time limit, I would like to ask you to indeed hold your questions either for the chat bot or for after the presentations. I think that is sufficient as an intro from my side. Bjorn, with all pleasure, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christoph, for giving me the floors. And as already said by Christoph, I'm in charge here in Central Europe for the corporate coverage side on the multinational activity. But more important for this meeting, I'm also in charge for the sustainable development of our bank here in the region. So therefore, I can tell you sustainability is very, very close to my heart. So it's a big pleasure for me to be part here of this joint event between the AHK and BNP Paribas. And this is for three reasons. First of all, I like AHK. And I think what you're doing all over the world, all over Central Europe, but also in Bulgaria, is a very, very important element, bringing people together, doing knowledge transfer. And I think here for sustainability, it's a very important element as well, because sustainability has a different grade of knowledge all over the world. And I think here in Central Europe, there is a lot of room for improvement. And this is also one of our tasks as BNP Paribas, to share our views, to share our knowledge with all of you to get a really increase of this topic. I would say the view on the topic and the view on the importance of this topic in the region. And the third point, obviously, you might have seen on my name, I'm not coming from Hungary or Bulgaria, I'm coming from Germany. So that's the third point why I like AHK as well. Let me shortly introduce the team we have today, our expert and specialists, who will look at the topic from very different angles. And I'm sure at the end of the day, at the end of the hour, you will have a fantastic view on it. So first of all, we have Alexandra Bazarov. She is our Global Head of Sustainable Finance and the Financial Institution Coverage within BNP Paribas. She will look back a little bit, a few weeks to COP26 and the key takeaways. She will look at how investors and other stakeholders look at sustainability, looking at regulatory environment and what will be upcoming changes in the near future. Then we have Nathalie Joubert, Deputy Head of CSR BNP Paribas. She will look from the CSR point of view and how you, and I think that's important for you as the bank, can react on all the needs coming from investors and adapt your policy. And she will do this obviously as an example on BNP Paribas, how we have done it. So I think it helps you a lot to understand what can be done and what obviously are the challenges in these implementations as well. And last but not least, we have Monsieur Kiss, Independent Non-Executive Director, Chair of the Audit Committee at the National Bank of Greece. So he will look at the framework or how the framework can be filled from a banking and insurance company's point of view, with a special focus on opportunity and challenges from national bank perspective. So you see, we look at the topic from all possible angles, and that at the end of the day, hopefully you will get a lot out of it. That's enough from my side. I'm more than happy to hand over to Alexandra for her presentation.
Thank you very much, Björn, and it's great to be with you all today. I'm just going to quickly share some slides with you, so if you just bear with me for 1 second. Hopefully it works. Are you able to see my slides now?
Yes, works well.
Fantastic. Well, thanks very much, Björn. And as Björn highlighted, we've recently had the COP26 in Glasgow more recently. And what I thought I'd do is just give you a high-level overview of what were the key takeaways from COP, because obviously it's been everywhere, but at the same time, it's quite hard to digest. In the end of the day, it was ultimately 2 weeks where there was over 197 countries present, and indeed, Bulgaria very much front and center of many of those discussions. So what were the key highlights? Well, first and foremost, as we know, it's been over 5 years since the Paris Agreement was agreed. And subsequently, this one was quite groundbreaking in the sense of it was the first time that the countries were able to come together and effectively ensure that the ambition was aligned with the Paris Agreement, for all those to remind people to keep global warming temperature well below 2 degrees and ideally at 1.5 degrees. So the tagline going into COP was very much keeping 1.5 degrees alive. Now, did that achieve it or not? Now, fundamentally on paper, arguably not. We went into COP with basically looking at the NDCs, the National Determined Contributions, aligned to more to 2.8 degrees. Now, I'm not going to go into the implementations and what that ultimately means in terms of from climate risk perspective, but you'll shortly see why regulators are so focused on this particular aspect from a financial stability perspective. Now, coming out of COP, depending on which report you looked at, we were more on a pathway of 1.8 to 2.4 degrees. But what really was very successful was the fact that they agreed to come back next year, over and beyond in 5 years' time, to revisit and update the national determined contributions to keep 1.5 degrees alive. So subsequently, that was ultimately met. But needless to say, there were 10 different pledges ultimately signed and agreed. Now, these ranged from very different aspects, and I think it's very important to really appreciate what this fundamentally means from a banking perspective, because by definition, with the countries now over 90% of them committed to net zero, clearly the European Union being one of, it means that policy and direction is rapidly changing, which means the real economies are equally changing. Therefore, if you look at pledge number 7, with the 100% zero emission vehicle sales by 2040, this means in terms of from a financing perspective, some companies will either transition to this new way of electrical vehicles or others won't, which boils back to these transitional risks, which are now very real in the economy as we start shifting towards a net zero economy. Banks, in the end of the day, are a mirror of the economy, and subsequently, the interaction between the public sector in terms of policy away from pure regulations is really important, because we're going to start seeing different speeds within different geographies transition to net zero. So not only did you see around the vehicles, but you also saw aspects around the aviation, and no surprise, one which obviously Bulgaria very much was behind around obviously the global coal to clean power transition statement, and ensuring that obviously while there isn't a phase out of coal, but clearly a phase down in terms of coal. And that was really quite groundbreaking for that COP, the fact that the first time fossil fuels were mentioned in ultimately the declaration. In addition to that, we saw the big aspect, which is around the financial institutions as a whole. Much talk around GFAS, which is known as the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. To give you a sense of the scale of what this is, this represents 450 financial firms across 45 countries. And it's not just purely banks. And Natalie will touch upon in terms of the Net Zero Banking Alliance and what that means once one is a signatory. Bnp Paribas was a founding member of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. But it does also include the asset managers and indeed the asset owners. And this obviously has real implications in terms of from an investor's perspective, because they are now starting to shift their portfolios towards net zero. So subsequently assets which otherwise would have been invested in. Unless there is clear transition pathways, those investments may no longer be investable. Hence, you often have terminology around stranded assets. But this also is not just a European phenomena, it's global. So it doesn't matter if you're in America or if it doesn't matter if you're in the APAC, but naturally there was a very strong backing from the Europeans in respect of GFAS. But going back to ultimately some other aspects of COP which were discussed. One is Article 6 was signed. This effectively will give an acceleration and evolution of the voluntary carbon markets. So up until now, this asset class has been subject to many discussions and debates, especially around how to use carbon offsets, but more importantly, the quality of these carbon offsets. So that was also very groundbreaking in the sense that Article 6 was signed. Now, fundamentally, there's still a long way to go before we start seeing liquid voluntary carbon markets, but in terms of new asset classes evolving and developing, that is clearly something to keep a close eye on. There are a lot of elements around Article 6.2 and 6.4 around the direction of travel and indeed the role the countries will play in developing this particular market. But it definitely got a boost and in a direction of increasing the transparency and the quality of this particular market. The other aspect of the COP was obviously a much bigger, greater focus on climate adaptation. Historically, we've always been focused on mitigation and clearly reducing carbon emissions, which boils down to a lot of the regulatory requirements around disclosure, around one's carbon emissions and aligning portfolios. But I think there is a real realization that climate change is upon us. And if we continue to be on a track of above 1.5 degrees, we will see more frequent and, dare I say it, more severe weather events. And therefore, the economy as a whole needs to start adapting and ensuring that we have resilient infrastructure to prevent the ultimate devastating consequences of some of the climate changes events that we're seeing across the globe. In addition to that, there was a big focus on financial collaboration. Why that? I mentioned the discussions around the public sector and the financial institutions around understanding policies and the transition pathways within the economy. It's also very important that many of the new technologies which are required going forward, which ultimately financial institutions will finance, there is much risk associated to them. So subsequently, be it with subsidies or indeed clear policy coming from countries, it is very important to give that catalytic effect with the new technologies and in developing countries, de-risking potential exposures to what otherwise is known as quite high-risk countries, and albeit indeed mitigate financial or foreign exchange exposures. So what we've definitely seen is a real appreciation that the public sector and the private sector needs to work a lot closer together to ensure that we mobilize the finance that is ultimately needed to meet the Paris Agreement. In respect to the central banks, they were very much there en masse, and you may be familiar with the Network for Greening the Financial System. This now has 100 central banks across the globe, and indeed the ECB was one of the founding members, especially the very active Dutch and French central banks. This now is 100 members, and within there, they're obviously designing and indeed implementing various stress tests along with other policies to ensure that the financial system remains stable as we transition and potentially impacted by increasing climate change. Subsequently, some 38 central banks across the globe have committed to climate stress testing, and there is a much greater focus beyond just pure environmental risks, such as biodiversity loss. So while reporting under the TCFD, which is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, there is now the emergence of the TNFD, which is very much focusing on nature and the financial disclosure associated with that. So that in itself was obviously very prominent in terms of coming out of COP. Likewise, the role of the multilateral development banks. Many of you are familiar with the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development working in your region. What we started to see is they definitely need to scale up even further, to build the capacity within regions, but also support those investments and especially those new technologies where on a standalone basis they may not be bankable from the pure financial services. So what we've started to see within the multilateral development banks is once again to help mobilize that private finance by utilizing different platforms and instruments such as blended finance. And again, a big focus and commitment around climate adaptation and indeed on nature-based solutions and natural capital as a whole, as one starts to appreciate that actually climate change along with biodiversity is the same coin, but just different sides of it. So on the whole, a lot came out of COP and it's quite hard to digest. What is for sure, there is no turning back when it comes to the financial institutions and indeed the role that they play to help the transition towards net zero. And therefore, it's no surprise when it comes to a regulatory standpoint, within the EU, the EC has designed an ESG legislative framework that will impact all companies and particularly the banks and financial services. Now, this page looks quite busy, but fundamentally, we know within the European Union that they've got economic ambitions which were outlined by the EU Green Deal and the EU Fit for the 55 package. Now, to go about that, we ultimately need to ensure that the transparency is there, but also to mitigate aspects around greenwashing and more importantly for banks to understand what they're really investing in. And therefore, we have seen the development of the EU taxonomy regulation and increasingly in terms of the disclosure aspects, and it doesn't matter if it's around the non-financial reporting directive or indeed around how asset managers and insurers need to report in terms of when they make their investments, what their funds are ultimately doing. And it's not just around disclosure, it's also greater scrutiny around products. So for banks which are now selling new products, it doesn't matter if it's green bonds, there is the evolution of the EU green bond standards. And indeed, one needs to have a better understanding in terms of the retail's investment choices, which is around what they prefer when it comes to ESG matters. So there's a lot there, and obviously we haven't yet touched upon, obviously, the risk frameworks which are put in place around the bank's stress testing in terms of ultimately making sure that banks have a real grasp and grip around what climate change really means, focusing on both physical risks, but also the transitional risks and increasing litigation risk. And that's why in terms of the disclosure and products, they're all very much interlinked. In the end of the day, when we recognize that the economy is moving towards net zero, there is clearly a greater appreciation and commitment from the financial sector as a whole, and hence you do have the GFAS and the various net zero alliances. So Natalie's now going to talk about what is the net zero banking alliance, how BNP Paribas has started to adapt to this changing world, and it's not something which has just started since COP, but obviously an evolution. And I think that's clearly a message that we need to send. This very much is a journey, and there's a lot to digest, and indeed how one puts in these strategies. I think you'll learn a lot from Natalie, how we've done it very much from a BNP Paribas perspective. So I hope you found this overview helpful in terms of the key highlights, focusing on the outcomes of COP and indeed the evolving regulatory landscape that we face within a European context.
Yes, thank you very much, Alexandra, for giving us this fantastic insight about what are the takeaways of COP26. And I clearly would say there are some nice achievements, but still a long way to go and a lot of things to do. And as you highlighted, public and private sector needs to work more together to achieve the goal. So thank you very much for this and the journey. And I think that's the fantastic handover to you, Natalie. The journey is how BNP Paribas has looked at this from the CSR point of view, how we have implemented the CSR topics in our group strategy. So the floor is yours to give us all a view on best practice.
Thank you. As you have seen with Alexandra before, the subject is quite a complex one because we have a lot of stakeholders. So what I will try to share with you today is two things. First, what kind of governance, what kind of tool did we develop within BNP Paribas to cope with those subjects, and then what does it mean for a bank to commit to align with a net zero economy. So to begin with the first part and how this is handled in BNP Paribas, we can move to the next slide and the one after probably. What is difficult is to really handle the subject and embed the subject within the company and in each business line and each function. First step for us was to put this idea of company purpose within the mission of BNP Paribas, and this has been done. I think it's important because it really sends a signal both internally and externally, that sustainability, being a sustainable finance leader, is key for the bank. But this is probably not sufficient. And if we move to the next slide, we can see that what is also needed is really to have a strong CSR function. So within BNP Paribas, it's the CSR function. You can find different names in different banks or in different companies, but the idea, I think, is that it's very important to have a direct link with the board of directors and have a direct link with the top management. In BNP Paribas, this is linked to the fact that we are part of a big team called the Company Engagement Department, which is reporting to the Executive Committee. We do have a Sustainable Finance Strategic Committee sponsored by our CEO, and we do have a team big enough to be able to develop a network with each part of the bank. So just to give you an idea, BNP Paribas is 200,000 people throughout the world. We are 25 FTE within the bank, but we do have a network of around 170 people. If we move to the next slide, we can see that within this governance, we also have links with committees within the bank. And I think it's very important if you want to really help the development of sustainability and CSR to have access to existing committee and have the sustainability view in existing committees. So for us, it can be either credit committees or it can be a supervisory and control committee. The idea is really to try to embed those questions of extra financial topics within existing tool. If we move to the next slide, we will see that another key element are our key CSR indicator. Because we are a bank, because our stakeholders are asking us to demonstrate what we do, we put a lot of energy in finding indicators that can be followed throughout the time and demonstrate our commitment and our progress. And something which we have learned throughout time is that it's important to find KPIs broad enough so everybody feels that they are linked to this KPI and that they can help develop them and improve them, but also precise enough that our stakeholders really understand what we do. So in BNP Paribas, we have set 4 different topics. Economic responsibility, which is the fact that bank is here to support its client in the economy and support a long-term economy. And we have made a link with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Second is linked to our social responsibility. This is linked to the HR part and to the staff. Third part is civic responsibility, linked to the fact that we do have communities we're working with, we do have a link with the civil society, and we need to be an active participant. Last one is the one Alexandra mentioned before around our environmental responsibility. If we move to the next slide, you will see that this KPIs are also linked to the variable remuneration of the executive corporate. This has been a very important step for us to build the credibility of the subject, not really, to be honest, because of the amount at stake within this variable remuneration, because it's only part of the variable remuneration, but rather to kind of lift up the interest in the subject. It has helped us promote the subject, explain to our executive corporate officers what does it mean and how they can contribute. And I think even though it may be difficult to have a big part of remuneration linked to extra financial criteria, having at least a small part of it is a very efficient tool to promote the subject. If we move to the next slide, we will see another key element. We are analyzed by a lot of external stakeholders including extra financial urgency. We do put a lot of energy in explaining what we do, and we consider that those extra financial rating agencies are probably the one who are the most challenging counterpart when we're discussing about ESG criteria, but the one which are very important to convince. It's all the more important that those agencies used to be small boutique agencies, very European-centric, and they are now have merged with large financial rating agency, and they are embedded in the financial rating agency. So having the strong link with external stakeholders, being able to demonstrate how we stand is key. And I have put here the rating on the main extra financial rating agency we're following. The next slide is around being active in the society. So it means, of course, we need to be active internally to promote new products, new services, having a good ESG risk analysis, but we also need to be active externally. And we have our top management being part of external committees or chair or think tank to really do the job both ends. First, explain what the bank is able to do and what the bank is not able to do. And on the other hand, receive stakeholder feedback and stakeholder expectation to be able to adapt. So we are part of Entreprise pour l'Environnement, which is a think tank, not only with bank, with all kinds of corporates, part of the UNEP-FI with a principle for responsible banking, but also TCFD and TNFD. And TNFD is the task force for biodiversity. If we move to the next slide, I will now explain what does it mean for a bank like BNP Paribas to be part of what was called during COP26 the race to net zero. So I'm sure you're all aware, but just a quick feedback. The idea of the Net Zero Banking Alliance is to find to really put together all the actors which can promote a net zero economy. A net zero economy is not an economy with no emission. It's rather an economy where the emission will be low enough to be compensated by the carbon sink. And this is key for a bank. What we try to do is not to finance an economy with zero emission. We try to help our clients to reduce their emission so our economy is sustainable. And for that, we are part of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. So this Net Zero Banking Alliance is part of a bigger group called GFANS, where you have Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, Asset Manager Alliance, Insurer Alliance. And you can see just by the name that the idea is really to have every entity bringing its part and doing its part in this net zero alignment. What did we commit to? First, to transition GHG emissions of our lending and investment portfolio with a pathway to net zero. Second, to build our transition scenario on really well-recognized and science-based source. And this is key. What we want to do is really to benchmark ourselves to what the science requests and not what we would like to be, or not something too small or not ambitious enough. Then we have to prioritize. It's obvious that we cannot do everything in the same time. So we've got to choose first the most GHG intensive sector, work on those, and progressively increase the scope of our alignment. We've got to set intermediate targets, and this is key. The targets should be ambitious enough to be aligned with net zero, close enough to be credible. I mean, we do not want to have 2050 targets with no view in the meantime. So we have to set targets with no later than 2030, and we have to report annually on our progress. So within BNP Paribas Group, BNP Paribas as a group is part of Net Zero Banking Alliance. Cardiff, our insurance company, is part of the Asset Owner Alliance, and Asset Management, our Asset Management Alliance. The idea being to have all the bank working in the same direction. If we move to the next slide, what you will see is how we can do that and a few examples. If you want to align with a Net Zero Banking Alliance, we know that we have to work on the energy sector, both power and oil and gas sector. And I think this is a key idea. It's not only a global commitment, it's a commitment that has to be translated in business decision. So for BNP Paribas, we have begun working on power alignment for a while ago now, and we know that if we want to be aligned, we need to reduce our exposure to coal and increase our exposure to renewable. So we have public policy explaining what we will do and what we will not do, and this is key. We have to be very open, very transparent, and to explain to our clients, our stakeholders, what we will not do. And because we have committed to be out of coal by 2030 in Europe and OECD and by 2040 for the rest of the world, this is very clear that we had to exit some clients and some relationship of companies which were also very clear about the fact that they didn't want to exit coal. So when a client is ready to transition, we are here to help. When a client clearly states that they do not want to be aligned with this net zero commitment in power, then we have exit a certain number of relations. Same for fossil fuel. We have taken our commitment to reduce our exposure to upstream financing of oil and gas. It's a 10% reduction by 2025, and progressively we will develop this commitment on fossil fuel because we think we need probably to be more explicit. So this is the kind of conservative part, risk part. On the other part, we will develop our financing to renewable energy. We will develop new innovative solutions, for example, with Solar Impulse Venture Fund, and we will get organized to have people on board ready to accompany our clients. So we have launched last October a low carbon transition group, which will help clients to accelerate the transition. And we expect to have 250 professionals worldwide being part of this group internally. And if we move to the next slide, and I think this is a kind of overview of where all those decisions are taken within the bank. What are the tools? You can find on our website all of our sector policy, because once again, it's very key for us to be transparent about what we expected from our clients. And we also have internal guidelines to make it simple to people internally to decide where they should go and what kind of decisions should be taken. I think we're almost at the end of, no, I have a few more slides. Maybe the last slide. If we want to implement this alignment, we have to have a very strong ESG framework. So we have to have internal norms on reporting, and we're working with the finance department for that. We have to have a good assessment of each of our clients, and we're working with the risk department for that. We have to be able to analyze our portfolio transversally, and we work with people in charge of stress tests for that. And we have to have a very robust data and IT system, and we're working with our chief data officer and IT department. So I hope that I give you a flavor of how BNP Paribas handle this question of embedding sustainability question and aligning with net zero banking, net zero commitment. For us, the key element is really to put this question in each and every part of the bank and have everybody contributing to the same target.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for giving us this view. And I think the roadmap was clear, starting from the company purpose, put a strong CSR function in it, and building the link between CSR, the board of directors, and the supervisors. I really appreciate also your practical example in regarding coal policy and what does it mean at the end of the day, saying very strictly to clients, happy to support you if you're willing to change. And if not, you might not be the right client. And I think that's the good handover to Monsieur, especially looking at the link between CSR, the board members, and the supervisory board. So, Monsieur, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for Alexandra and Natalie, who gave very comprehensive and also insightful and precise view of what is the CSR framework and context in which banks evolve and need to adjust. If we move to the first slide, I won't elaborate too much. So next slide, please. So we know that there's an increased sensitivity of the society at large, change of consumption habits, awareness of the impact on finance on project prioritization. So prioritizing the rise of sustainable savings, sustainable finance, the response of the public authority at all levels. So of course, governments in their local policies. So you have local law. In Greece, there's a local climate law that has been just passed, but also international cooperation, because environment issues have no borders, so need to be tackled globally. Also, and the COP was a big reminder of that without international cooperation, there's no potential to influence the evolution of the environment and the climate. and COP, as we know, it's COP26, so it started already in the 90s, but now the momentum is increasing, and that's why all actors need now to move on and pass from reflection to action. And you see also local authorities are taking on the environmental challenge. The challenge for companies is, and we'll move into that in the next slide, but just mentioning is, it's difficult for companies to adjust their stakeholder management, because you know that companies, we all know that companies have various stakeholders. You have the shareholder, you have the customers, you have the staff, and you have the society at large. And the latest trend in the last, I would say, 40 years was more focusing on the shareholder priority for company management, and therefore focusing more on financial performance. And now we know that the company need to adjust their stakeholder management. And this is a balancing act. The balance is between the various stakeholders, so which kind of priority do you give, and trying to align stakeholder interest on a comprehensive framework, which is not solely focusing on financial performance. And this balance is a risk-reward balance. So the risk is, of course, if climate change become a reality and a threatening reality, as Alexandra mentioned, we need to protect the asset of the bank, and we need to also protect the financial performance of the bank, notably in the credit risk. So if you have significant move and transition, part of, and this was the concept that was mentioned previously, of stranded assets. So what do you do and how do you push for the transition? You have also the value of the asset under management, because you see that with the investor becoming more vocal, you've seen that recently with Shell, where one of the largest shareholder, I think was a Dutch pension fund, decided to sell all its Shell shares. Of course, the value and the stock price moved accordingly. So there's a risk there, and even for good financial stewardship, banks need to onboard this impact of climate. Of course, you have also the larger risk of how the institution is perceived by the community, and notably with the social media and with the larger community expressing themselves more clearly. Banks need to be very aware of how their policies are perceived by the larger public. I happen to work for a long time for HSBC, for instance. For us, when there was all this palm oil debate, the policy of HSBC in funding palm oil industries was very much on top of the issue, and then the bank had to react very quickly to make sure they would be compliant with best environmental practice. And then the last risk, which is a real one, and that's why the banks need to work closely with the governments and the international institution, is the competitive landscape. Because we know that for banks, notably, we need to make sure that the policy we implement are aligned with the global trend and the global framework. Because if you stop funding certain industries that other banks will fund, you may be at a competitive disadvantage. Therefore, the ability for authority to create a level playing field is very much important. But beyond the risk side, there's of course the opportunity side, and the energy transition will require massive investments, and the ability to position the bank into be knowledgeable and being able to understand what are the good projects that will be successful, to cooperate with development banks or to cooperate with national or international initiatives to fund energy transition, will be also a competitive advantage. So you have the risk, but you have also this big opportunity. For the bank, of course, the challenge is to create the framework, to build the data set, to be compliant with the regulation, and the regulation is increasing rapidly, and also to build a framework by which it can disclose exactly what it is its contribution or its current position in terms, notably for climate on carbon emission. So you have the direct carbon emission of the institution, the indirect by the energy it's consumed, and also the more broader indirect impact by the industry and the project it is funding. So this environment forced the bank, of course, as Natalie said very clearly, to build an infrastructure to be able to measure exactly where we are and how we progress. And therefore, we need to set precise objective backed by rigorous data with clear goals with target dates. So 2020, the usual target dates are 2025, 2030, and 2050. And we need to develop an internal reporting and external disclosure that are well aligned. If we move to the next slide, which is what is the role of a bank board? Because that's my position with this National Bank of Greece, although I've been with HSBC as a CFO for 25 years, lately 10 years. So I chair the audit committee. So how, as a board, do we try to move on and make sure that National Bank of Greece play its part in this transition and in this evolution? The first remark is that National Bank of Greece has been the first bank created in Greece. So its implication in the society is huge because it's one of the first, it's the first financial institution in Greece, and it's the largest bank in terms of customer number. So they've always been mindful of their impact on the Greek society. But on this environmental issue, we need to recognize that we need to build up expertise. It's a very steep learning curve, as you've seen with Alexandra and Natalie's presentation. Making sure you address correctly all these issues mean that you need to get much more knowledgeable about what's going on and what you need to measure and how you need to pivot the activity of the bank and adjust maybe its business model to make sure it will be compliant with this new norm. So at board level, we need to have a lot of training because none of us are real expert of these issues. So we do undergo training, and we also engage a lot with the structure of the bank who's developing to undertake this transition. So like in BNP, National Bank of Greece has an ESG department that reports to the Chief Compliance Officer. We have a board committee on governance on ESG issues, so basically governance, environment, and social impact. And all the work done by the bank in this field are reported to this committee, of which I'm a member, by the way, and are also then reported to the board. So the board need to take hold of this issue. The difficulty, I may say, is that at board level, you're fairly high level, so you need to engage a lot with the team and make sure that the policies that are developed make sense, respect the balance I was just mentioning before between risk and opportunities, and also are concrete. So what are the objectives? And we, on that stage, we still at the beginning of the journey. It's a long journey. At the beginning of this journey, we are now working on building the data set that help us comply with the SFDR regulation and which will be implemented and with the ESG taxonomy. And getting the real data is difficult because not only do you need to have the data for yourself, but you need to gather the data of your customers. And also we're engaging with the rating agency who are specializing on ESG rating to make sure that we have a clear view. So for instance, in Greece, we're financing shipping. So shipping, we know, can be a contributor to carbon emission. Should we apply the principle of carrot and stick and making sure we will not finance going forward, maybe not now, but in the time frame that we can set ships that are not using clean energy? These are the kind of debates that we have within the bank. And that's where also having a level competition playing field is important, because if we're the only bank doing that, all the other banks will enter this gap and we will lose our franchise. So therefore, we need also to influence the regulator and influence the wider community to make sure that the decisions we take are in line with the move of the trends. But we need to be leader in that. So as a board, we supervise the implementation, notably the build of the right data set. We're supporting the policy. We have also to have clear goals in terms of the timing of the transition and what are the objectives we determine and what are the target date. We also need to make sure we respect compliance. We need to make sure that the disclosure of our ESG impact has integrity. And as chair of the audit committee, this will be a new chapter because we concentrate mainly as an audit committee on financial disclosure. We also concentrate on internal audit finding, external audit to make sure that the risks are well controlled. But now we need also to embrace the disclosure of ESG impact of the bank and make sure it complies with the new regulation. We will also participate in the ECB climate stress test. So this will happen this year in 2022. And this will be also a very important exercise to help us build the right framework and the right understanding of the climate change impact on our business model. So in a nutshell, that's what as board member we need to focus on. So we recognize the very huge importance of this problematic on the future of the bank. We need to set the right balance between risk, reward, and short-term, long-term various stakeholder interest and make sure we participate in the move and the trend in the society adaptation of all these environmental and climate issues. And this will be a very big priority for the board. So we'll have monthly session of the board to follow up on the update of what the bank is doing in this field. So that's in a nutshell how, as board member, we try to make sure the bank will be leader in this field.
Thank you very much, Mathieu, for giving us the insight from the board view on all these topics. And I'm very happy that there are a lot of similarities in our strategy. But I think we all know it's a long journey and it's nothing which comes overnight. There's a lot of implementation. But I think that's a good handover, Christoph, to the audience to give us their questions. So I would say the floor is yours to ask your question towards all the speakers we have on the panel.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for this very interesting and insightful overview, Alexandra, Nathalie, Mathieu, and Bjorn. I think it gave a view on the complexity where we are looking at from financial services perspective. So please, I welcome and I invite everybody who has a question. I was looking into the chat. There are for now no questions in the chat provided, but anybody who has a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question to Bjorn and his team members. Just to make sure there is no prize for the first question, so no need to wait for that or to embark on that. You can embark immediately if you would like to.
Hello, it's Polina Dikova, United Bulgarian Bank. I would like just to ask, do you have some insights of the expected taxonomy developments? Some amendments are expected in the end of the year, but maybe not.
Yeah, happy to take that. Obviously, it's an ever-evolving topic, and as you know, at the moment, there's a lot of discussion around what should be included in the EU taxonomy, especially when it comes to natural gas and nuclear. Clearly, I think there's recognition that, you know, in terms of the transition, there is obviously application for both of those, and in particular when it comes to nuclear. But needless to say, in terms of the broader sustainable agenda, and indeed if you look at the various IEA reports, there is no role for gas in terms of getting down to that net zero. It ultimately needs to transition down. So the inclusion, obviously, when you have an EU taxonomy, which obviously then subsequently has a lot of applications, because under the SFDR reporting requirement, you do need to ultimately align your investments towards the EU taxonomy. And then subsequently, as an investor going into those funds, you would assume that they're ultimately doing good. And hence, that's why the inclusion in particular of gas has been very controversial at this point in time. It's still obviously up for a lot of discussions. The reality is, initially the EU taxonomy was designed, very much as a dictionary of what is green and what isn't green. And in the end of the day, the taxonomy should have perhaps been slightly more of what we would call a transition dictionary, because ultimately we recognize at particular points in time, because we all know the lights need to be turned on and we do need different sources of energy as we transition towards net zero and obviously build up the capacity in the other industries. So that's obviously an evolving topic, and there's much discussion. And just so you know, in terms of lessons learned from that, the UK is ultimately looking at their taxonomy and trying to see actually should it embed more of the transition languages in there. And the reason, as I said, is because those two aspects are clearly not green on a standalone, despite the roles that they can help in terms of supporting the transition. The other evolution is obviously around a social taxonomy. We've spent a lot of time on this particular discussion around the environmental, really coming out of the backdrop of COP, but recognizing that this transition does need to be just. And I think there's a lot of work now going on in terms of how we can knit both the E and the S slightly closer together, because at the moment there does seem to be a bit of a gap between when one looks at environmental aspects over and beyond the social aspects. So there's a lot of work going on in respect to the just transition, and in turn giving more of a framework around this social aspects, and hence the developments on the social taxonomy as well. I don't know if Natalie wanted to add anything more.
Thank you.
Christoph, you're on mute. Sorry.
That, Björn. Thanks for the answer to that question, Alexandra. Maybe a question to Mathieu. From my perspective, Mathieu, you mentioned it several times, and I think indeed it's crucial. You mentioned for me three key elements. It's a steep learning curve for the financial organizations, one, at all levels, starting from the board down to the organization. Two, what I liked in your resume is that we should not forget the opportunity side. It comes to us like an avalanche of regulations and obligations, but there are definitely opportunities for the financial industry to consider, where leaders in this framework can definitely benefit from. I'm fully convinced about that as well. But what you also mentioned, and what I think is crucial, is the level playing field. Because this only works when that level playing field is there. Now, you from your board perspective, looking at that, how do you see that evolve, and how do you see action between different regulators being aligned there in order to create that level playing field?
So I think this is a fundamental issue. Because of course the big risk for the banks is if they get out of financing certain type of industry or project, then you will have other kind of actors that may move in, dark pool or whatever. But this we cannot do anything. So we want a level playing field for banks. I think the advantage, because National Bank of Greece operates in Greece only now, and they are supervised by the European Central Bank. So I think the European Central Bank and the regulator, which is very hands-on, is the lever by which the authority can help create this level playing field. And the taxonomy is a very good first move, because of course, and you know all the debate about greenwashing is you can pretend to do green financing, whereas when you go in the crux of the issue and deep dive, it's not really the case. So I think giving credibility to the disclosure, notably on environment issues and climate impact, is absolutely key, because that's the first step. Once you have that, and you force the banks to disclose what they do in the open field, this is a dynamic that help create this level playing field, because the judge will be the society, the politician, the customers, and that will force the bank to move in sync. Hopefully, some will go faster, and they will be recognized for that, and this may be a competitive advantage, because all of a sudden the customer will prefer to go to financial institutions that commit themselves to something which is important for the customer, notably the younger generation, because for them it's much more threatening than for the older generation. So I think this is a way. The other point I would make is we need to use the carrot and stick thing. For instance, you could do for mortgages higher margin or higher rate for mortgages on property that are not compliant to carbon neutral performance, and much more incentivized than customer to move. So there's a set of tools you can try to use, but of course the dialogue with the authorities, meaning national, and in the case of Greece, European, will be a key element. To be fair, now European Central Bank, for instance, toward the Greek banks, is ahead of us. So we need to play catch up. We need to build this taxonomy. We need to understand it, to implement it, to store the data, to create the data infrastructure. It happened that we are in a move to change our core banking system, and the data set behind our core banking system now need to include this set of data to make sure that we can comply.
Okay.
And on also the opportunity, I think we work now with the European plan. You know, after COVID, there's a lot of public money that will be allocated to countries, and this money need to be also used at good purpose, and notably including projects that help the energetic transition. So we need to position ourselves and to be a leader of renewable energy financing in Greece.
Thank you, Mathieu. Indeed, very important topic. We have reached our time slot, but I think it is not a problem to go a couple of minutes over. So are there any other questions from the audience towards the team?
Well, if this is not the case, I have one question to Natalie, and I think you explained very well how we as Bnp Paribas have integrated CSR in our group strategy in the daily life and working. And I think Mathieu mentioned it as well for the National Bank of Greece, that it has been implemented. What is your view? Is this the exceptions, or is this, from the banking point of view, that you see most of the bank already started to implement it, CSR in their group strategy? So what is the percentage of achievement? If you can say more or less regarding competitors or banking sectors.
I will not have a precise percentage to share with you. I will more share a feeling. My feeling is that as of today, there is no more bank outside this question. I mean, a few years ago, those extra financial questions were rather on philanthropy or something outside business. And this is not true anymore. One indicator is, I think we do have, I don't know, weekly calls with competitors throughout the world just to exchange view on how to implement our CSR strategy, including banks which are in very far away countries with less pressure from regulatory. So I think this is very interesting, because even though the pressure comes from clients, staff, regulatory, other stakeholders, my feeling is that everybody is moving. Then the level of maturity is very much different from one country to another, from one kind of bank to another, depending also on your business model. You may have much more pressure if you have a big capital market activity where you have investors, probably less pressure if you are a small agricultural bank, very local. But my feeling is that everybody is on the way at different level of maturity, but moving in the same direction.
And if I may add, so for National Bank of Greece, of course, we had four systemic banks in Greece which compete neck to neck. So we track the rating of each bank by all the rating agencies and see how we position ourselves in terms of rating. This is one indicator, and all banks now, systemic banks in Greece are rated, and we of course, we want to be leader in that. We're not yet, but we want to get there in the next 12 to 18 months.
Great. Thank you very much, both of you, for this answer. Any other questions from the audience?
I have a question for the audience is, how are the Bulgarian banks faring? I don't know whether there's someone in the audience that can answer that. How do they position themselves in this field, and whether it's a concern? And because Bulgaria is next to Greece, and National Bank of Greece used to have a subsidiary there, it would be interesting to see how it evolves in another European country next to us. I don't know whether someone can answer.
Well, I will give it a try, Mathieu. It's of course always dangerous to talk for the whole sector. Obviously, within KBC Group in Bulgaria, I think we are at a very similar level of understanding of and implementation, and struggling with implementation, as the team of Bnp Paribas here today explained. There is a very strong recognition of what is being done in BNP also within KBC Group, and that is done also on a group level, meaning also within Bulgaria. We do this across the group. Now, if I see that here, I think you have a distinction in Bulgaria between the international groups and the local banks. You clearly see a frontrunner understanding and let's say accepting the importance of this topic of the international groups. I think it's to a lesser extent the case on non-international groups. So I think we are working here in two speeds. And to be very honest, I think we are even working in three speeds, if I can be so honest, and you should not quote me on that. But I think in terms of regulator, the regulator is somewhere in the middle. The regulator is not in sync, and I mean mainly the local one. Obviously, the ECB monitored banks are working under ECB, and that's clear. But I think the local regulator is not yet in sync with ECB and international banking groups who are coming up to that speed. You said it yourself, Mathieu, probably ECB is a bit ahead of even the international banking groups, and we're trying to catch up with them. And probably the regulator here is somewhere in the middle of the international groups and the local groups in terms of understanding and taking this up here. So I think you have a diverse playing field, international banking groups, ECB related, the local regulator, which is somewhere floating in the middle, and then local organizations. And again, it's hard to make generalizations. There will be exceptions on what I'm saying, but that's how I feel is the local market here in Bulgaria today.
Okay, thank you very much.
And I know we have other Bulgarian colleagues in the call. We even have also colleagues from PwC, who obviously are in very close contact with the Bulgarian banking sector. So obviously I'm free to ask them for their view from their perspective. I hear no specific view from the colleagues from PwC on that.
I think they are on mute, so they need to unmute and then it works.
Okay. Anyway, I think this was a bit my view, Mathieu, on how the situation is in Bulgaria.
It's interesting. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Very good. If there are no further questions, we are 10 past 12 Bulgarian time. If there are no further questions, then I can just do one thing, or a couple of things. First of all, I would like to thank everybody who participated into this seminar. Thank you for joining and for your interest in the topic. I'm sure that if we would do this seminar in, let's say, 6 to 12 months, the level of maturity of our insights, but also probably the interest in terms of scope of the audience would even be larger. This is going to go fast ahead. But anyway, thank you for joining. And last but not least, obviously, Björn, Alexandra, Natalie, and Mathieu, a big thank you to all of you for joining us today, making the time for us, sharing your views, your experiences in a short, concise, but very clear way. Very much appreciated. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to Bnp Paribas team for joining us here. I'm looking forward to repeat this in the near future. As I said, this topic is evolving that fast. Follow-up sessions might be very interesting going forward. So thank you very much, Björn. And I want to give you, as our moderator, Björn, I want to give you the last word.
Well, thank you very much, Christoph. I will do it very shortly. So thanks to the team who have presented their different kind of view. And I think we have learned a lot. I think one of the messages, it's a long way. We all are on the way. We're all on the way of implementing CSR strategy. We need to have a good playing field, a level playing field, helped by national banks and by the government to have equal views and rights for everyone. It's challenging, but it's important, and we don't have so much time. So even COP26 is now 26, yeah. It's not much time we have to do everything, and it's sometimes painful, but I think we all need to do it. So thank you very much to you participants in this 1 hour, 10 minutes for giving us the chance to give you our view on this topic. So thank you very much, Alexandra, Natalie, and Mathieu, for being here tonight, today, and to show the view. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Bye.